Alright folks, let's talk about sword design. Occasionally viewers send me links to pictures of fantasy weapons and then they ask my opinion of them, and more often than not they end up being some kind of impractical, ludicrous design that would be utterly useless in a real fight. But I don't blame them, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. But this is one of the things that I'm here for, to debunk common misconceptions and nonsense and all that. So currently this here is the only fantasy sword that I have in my collection. This is the Valiant Armory Zombie Slayer. It's a fantasy design based on a historical longsword. The blade is pretty accurate in terms of historical designs. The grip obviously is not, and it is a good sword. It's high quality, it's well made and everything, it's useful, but it still has the typical issue of many fantasy designs, namely that they are just not that practical. Like, it lacks one of the main features that make the longsword good, that give it an advantage over some other designs, namely a pretty generous guard. This is what you normally have. Some longswords like this even have a secondary guard. Why is that useful? Well, not only because it protects your fingers a bit more, and trust me, hand shots are pretty common in sword fighting, but also it just gives you a lot extra options. You can strike with it, you can bind and hook, and you can do all sorts of things. This, on the other hand, is far less useful. I mean, I get the idea. It's called the Zombie Slayer. It's a hypothetical sword for a zombie apocalypse. So you don't need a guard, really. You won't be fencing with the zombies, at least hopefully. If they are both undead and smart and skilled enough to use swords, we're all dead. All our juicy brains will be sliced open and eaten. And sometimes fantasy swords are clearly inspired by historical ones. Like the Arak that you see in Game of Thrones. Yeah, that's pretty clearly inspired by the Egyptian khopesh. And in those cases they are typically a bit more sensical. But one thing that you may notice, if you just look at how small this thing is, and there is a good reason for that. I mean, the spine on this here is fairly thick, and if this was a lot larger, it would be quite heavy. And I've already done videos about that. There is a staggering misconception about how heavy historical swords supposedly were, and it always surprises people to learn how light they really were. Historical swords really didn't weigh all that much. You don't want them to weigh much, because then you can't move them as easily and they would tire you more quickly. And that's one of the main problems that I keep seeing with fantasy designs. A lot of fantasy swords are just way overly large and heavy. Many of them are also overly wide. This here is pretty much the maximum that I would think is reasonable in terms of blade width. This is really wide, as you can see. This is, well, the manufacturer calls this a bolo, but it actually looks more like a barong. And it makes sense, because a wider blade gives you a bit more cutting power, simply because there's more heft behind it. It's simply a bit more impact. But if you overdo it, especially if you have a blade that is both long and wide, yeah, that's where you start running into trouble. Another issue is that fantasy designs often go overboard with jagged edges and serrations and spikes here and there, which is not a good idea, really. If you look at something like this, if you were to, in a fight, stab this into your opponent's flesh, maybe between their ribs or something, imagine how difficult this would be to withdraw. There are reports of even smooth blades being stuck in the body of an opponent. So you can imagine that this kind of crap, it doesn't really do you any good. Spikes and serrated edges and hooks and whatnot would be very impractical, because they would snag a lot, which is would be less of a problem if you were to fight a naked opponent, but that's not very likely, is it? Granted, nowadays it's not very likely to end up in a sword fight anyway, which is good, but I'm sure you get my point. This is just about blade design in terms of practicality. The general thing that you should consider is if you go with something that is a historical design, especially if it is a sword or any kind of weapon that has been used for a longer period of time, you know that it is tried and true, if you will. If there had been any significant flaws in the design, any elements that would have rendered it impractical or disadvantageous to use, it would have been simply thrown out. So if a sword was used in several battlefields or in recurring duels, you can be pretty certain that it has its merits. Something like the Viking sword was used for a very long time, the rapier was used for a long time effectively, with variations of course, but the basic type has proven itself. Back in the day when people relied on these as tools for survival, you can be pretty sure that they were keen on figuring out what works and what does not. And something like the gladius, for instance, which has a long history of military success, yeah, that's a pretty solid, good design. Whereas a fantasy design, it has never been designed with the idea of having to use it in a life or death situation. It doesn't really matter if it's slightly impractical, a bit too large, a bit too heavy, a bit too many spikes and whatnot. It doesn't really matter because nobody is dependent on them anymore. So as much as I like unique designs, I mean, if you have followed my channel for any length of time, you know that I'm kind of a sucker for exotic knives and swords, but it has to be practical for me to fully appreciate it. Again, it's not like I'm dependent on those nowadays, so it's not a real practical consideration, but it just gives me a bit more appreciation for the design. I just like to know that a lot of thought and experience went into it and that it actually makes sense, that it could be used in a life or death situation. And please don't mistake what I'm saying for skepticism towards innovation in general. I'm all for innovation, it's a good thing. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that anyone could come up with a sword that is better than what has been there throughout history. Of course it's always possible. I'm just saying that a blade that has proven itself on a historical battlefield may have a bit more practical value than a blade that someone in the comfort of their modern home has imagined. But of course, since you don't have to fight with them anymore, you don't have to let such considerations spoil your enjoyment of fancy but somewhat pointless fantasy designs. This is just how I roll in terms of my personal collection. So, thanks for watching.
Dragon Claw Demon Ninja Dagger of Haste beats all.